T-minus 2 hours until the baby gets home. Let's do this. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Suzy and I've been reading. And for once when I say that, I actually have. We are now well into July, and so it is past time that I gave you guys my June wrap up. I read 11 books in the month of June, which I was pretty chuffed with, to be honest. I normally average between sort of 10, 12 books a month, but I hit a bit of a slog in the early part of June, and so I was really surprised that I managed that many in the end. Just a quick note to say, none of the books I read this month are here. This is purely illustrative. It sounds so silly when I say it out loud, but I thought it was the kind of thing booktubers do. They always have books in the background, so you go, solely aesthetic. Now, because this is my first ever wrap up on my channel, I thought it might be handy if I was to quickly run through how I'm planning to format these going forward. So I thought it'd be useful if I was to group together the books I read each month into genres so that you guys can go ahead and just zone in on the ones that interest you the most. The plan is that I'll put something on the screen somewhere to let you know what genre it is that I'm prattling on about at any given time, so that even if you're fast forwarding, you can still see what I'm talking about and just dive in when you want to. I know I'm quite an eclectic reader. I know that it's going to be really rare to find someone out there who wants to listen to every single book review I do each month because my tastes vary so much. So I figured this made sense. It did in my mind, but I would love to hear your feedback. I've been known to be wrong before, so go ahead and leave me a comment down below if you think that this is helpful, if it works, if it's even necessary, and nothing is set in stone. So seeing as it is my house, my rules, I decided to go with fantasy first. In June, I finally managed to get my hands on The Girl in the Stars by Mark Lawrence. This is the first book in a new high fantasy trilogy from him called The Book of the Ice. Lawrence wrote one of my favourite fantasy trilogies, which is The Book of the Ancestor, starting with Red Sister. It follows Nona, who is a young girl training to be a holy assassin under the tutelage of some badass magical nuns, and it is as good as it sounds. You should definitely go and read it. Besides the brilliant character development in that series, I mean, shout out to Kettle and Apple, who are still two of my all-time favourite characters. It had an exciting plot, it was a fresh take on some old tropes, and I really enjoyed the world building. The Book of the Ancestor is set in a world called Eyre, which was once inhabited by a highly advanced civilization known as the Missing. Now, they're known as such because they all abandoned the planet the minute that they realised it was doomed, because the sun's warmth was failing and the planet was slowly but surely becoming consumed by ice. By the time we pick up Eyre's story in the Book of the Ancestor, only a tiny green belt around the equator line remains. Everything else is ice. In the Book of the Ancestor, we meet a character who hails from one of the ice tribes who live on the ice itself. But besides a little bit of their backstory and a period of time when another one of the characters from the series finds himself on the ice, we don't really see very much of it. Considering that the ice is 99.9% of the planet, it was ripe for further development, and that's precisely what Lawrence has done with this series. Whilst Nona's story is set in the small vestige of populated land around the middle of the planet, The Girl and the Stars expands its scope to focus on the world that exists on the ice itself. Now, clearly, the ice is an incredibly inhospitable environment to live in, and only very few people can survive there. You have got to be made of some seriously tough stuff to survive even a night out there, much less a lifetime. Not only that, but we find out in the Book of the Ancestor that there are malignant spirits that dwell within the ice and they are desperate to escape. I was so excited to see what Lawrence did with the amount of potential that he afforded himself with this. The scope was absolutely huge. There was potentially no limits here. And from what I saw in the Book of the Ancestor series, he definitely had the imagination and the world building skills to pull this off. But man, was I disappointed. The setting is cool, but if I have made it seem in any way like Lawrence relied super heavily on all the world building that he did in the Book of the Ancestor trilogy, then I've done it right. Despite the fact that the stories are in no way directly linked, Lawrence has made it absolutely impossible to read this latest series unless you have first read the Book of the Ancestor trilogy. Now that is a great marketing strategy in theory, but honestly, it's a bit shitty in practice. Now, don't get me wrong, I loved the Book of the Ancestors series. I don't think it is in any way a waste of your time to go and read it. But the point is, you shouldn't have to. This was clearly marketed as a standalone spin-off that happened to be set in the same world, but wasn't a companion series to the Book of the Ancestor. But there are so many holes in the world building that unless you have first read the other trilogy, you aren't going to have the context you need around the main concepts, the world itself, or the magic system. And what really grinds my gears about this is that it was completely, entirely avoidable. It really wouldn't have taken much for Lawrence to replicate a little bit more of the world building that he'd already done in the Book of the Ancestors series. He literally could have copy and pasted at points. It would have been less than a chapter's worth of material, but it would have filled in so many gaps. But I also struggled to connect with the characters in this one, and the story, where it could have been incredible, it just fell really flat for me. The story follows Yaz, who is a young woman of the Eyre tribe. Now, the Eyre tribe are revered by all other tribes on the ice because they live on the polar ice, where temperatures are so extreme that they have to literally sew themselves into another skin to survive. Lawrence did a good job of setting the scene in the early stages and describing just how harsh life is for Yaz and the others on the ice. Now, the early plot development revolved around it, so he really did need to nail it, and he really did. This is some Spartan shit. Every 4 years, everybody from across the ice travels towards one central point where a magistrate assesses all of the children of the tribes, and if there is anything even slightly untoward or unusual or unexplained about them, they are thrown down a hole in the ice, never to be heard of again. This includes things like physical disability, neurodiversity, so just be warned about that going in. This death sentence looms over anyone from the ice who is considered to show any of these signs of weakness, and as Yaz is travelling to the latest meet, she knows that her life is in danger because there is something very different about her. Yaz has been able to hide it from her family so far, but she knows she won't be able to hide it from the magistrate. But when Yaz and her tribe, including her family, make it to the meet and Yaz lines up for inspection, she is spared. Now, she doesn't know why. She only knows that she is incredibly grateful to have dodged this death sentence. But unfortunately, somebody that she loves isn't as lucky, and in a moment of absolute grief, Yaz throws herself down the hole after them. From there, we follow Yaz as her world expands and she faces dangers hitherto untold and a past long, long forgotten. I wish I could tell you that I loved it, but I give it 2 stars. Besides the issue of over-reliance on its predecessor, which honestly just smacks of lazy writing to me, and the fact that I couldn't connect with the characters as well in this one, I also found it really predictable at points, and it was just such a letdown. There is a reveal about 40% of the way through this one, which if you've read the Book of the Ancestor, which of course Lawrence wants you to do, save him having to do all that extra world building, you will know what's coming. It's not a surprise. In actual fact, it was a pretty key element of the Book of the Ancestor trilogy. This was just such a missed opportunity. So disappointing. On top of that, the story didn't really have any guts to it. I mean, it kept saying it did, but where? The best way I can describe that is when someone is apologising to you, but they don't mean it. They say all the right words, they're all in the right order, but the feeling is completely MIA. You know it, they know it, there are no winners here. It felt very much like just going through the motions. And just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, there was a love square. That's right, a square. I really struggle with love tangles of any shape or size. I just can't get along with them, generally speaking. So I was disappointed to see one in here, but what made it even worse is that this was based on another one of my most hated tropes, which is that this girl ain't like the others. Yaz, as main characters tend to be, is pretty exceptional, and it just seemed like every bloke within a 10-mile radius of her who wasn't related to her or wasn't gay wanted to marry her. Really? It was just so unnecessary, and in fact it added nothing to the story. All it served to do was distract Lawrence from the bit that he should have been focusing on. Things like his plot development and his character development. If he had only spent more time worrying about that than worrying about who should be vying for Yaz's attentions. This could have been a much better book. Not only that, but the central idea of the whole thing, it wasn't even original. It is actually a bastardization of a very, very, very old myth. It is only the incidental details that are new, and to be honest, those were compromised by poor choice after poor choice in the writing for me. One thing that I personally thought it did well though was that it put the grim in grimdark. There were some pretty graphic descriptions of severed body parts, cannibalism, and obviously throwing disabled children down holes. I have tried to be as fair as possible in this one, but I think it's pretty easy to tell. I was really deflated after having had such a positive experience with Lawrence and his writing before. This was nothing but a disappointment for me. I will pick up more from Lawrence in the future, I think, but it won't be from this series. Next up, I have got A Plague of Giants by Kevin Hearne. To my absolute shame, this one sat on my shelf for over a year before I even deigned to pick it up. Now, a year is not a particularly long time for a book to sit on my shelf waiting for me to choose it, but this was a library book. So I took this book out on an absolute whim one day right before COVID hit. Now, our library, much like everybody else's, I'm sure, closed down throughout the early phases of COVID especially. And then it started to offer auto-renews on books because, of course, nobody knew what was going to happen next. So this one sat on my shelf being merrily renewed month after month, and it wasn't until the libraries reopened fully and they wanted it back that I suddenly thought, oh yeah, better read that. Honestly, the reason I think I didn't pick it up any sooner is this is a tome. It is a 600 plus page book, and like I said, I picked it up on a whim, so I didn't really know much about it. It's a bit like choosing books in the old days, you know, before. Weird. I was excited, however, to see that it had a 4.05 average rating on Goodreads. Now that is astronomical for Goodreads. It doesn't have the largest amount of reviews or number of ratings, so that number is relative, but it's pretty high. I cannot believe I am saying this then, but I DNF'd it, and I DNF'd it hard. I do not DNF. I have a whole discussion video around this topic planned for my channel because it can be so divisive. You either do or you don't, and I am firmly in the don't camp. That is no shade to all of you guys out there who can DNF. I wish I had your discipline. But the truth is, I have serious FOMO, and underneath this slightly giggly, sort of squeaky voice that I've got, I am a stone cold witch and I love a good hate read. So for me to DNF a book, you gotta know it was bad. So A Plague of Giants is an epic fantasy story, and it's the start of a series called The Seven Kennings. So we dive into a city under siege. The mainland has been invaded by a previously unknown race of giants who have taken everybody by complete surprise. While the people within the city walls all try and wait out the storm, a bard tells them the story of the war that they're currently living through, who's involved, how it got started, how it's all come to this. The bard stitches together dozens of individual accounts to paint this picture of the whole story, and it's through this retelling that we find out what's going on as well. Now, the first 30 pages of this were an absolute mess. Now, the author spent way too much time trying to paint the picture of what was going on rather than telling us what was going on. I can kind of appreciate this tactic because it did definitely give this impression of chaos and nobody really knowing the whole story other than this bard, but I was desperate for some semblance of sense just running through the middle of it, just something that I could hold on to, and it wasn't there. It all does start to come together around about the 40-page mark, so you don't have to endure that for too long, but as far as I was concerned, it was too long. But then I started to find that there were some things in the story that I really liked. There were some things that I really, really liked. One of the things I really liked was the cause and effect element of the magic system. Now, the magic system in this book seems to be pretty central to the story as a whole. It revolves around powers known as kennings. So basically, certain people have a particular affinity with one element or another. They're able to wield that element and become a master of it, use it to their own end. But depending on the level of power that they're using or how often they're using it, it can strip decades from your life. But for every one thing that I liked in this book, there were a bunch of things I disliked. Straight off the bat, I really struggled with the storytelling style. It felt choppy and performative to me, and I was really struggling to connect with any of the characters because of it. Things also seem to be stretched beyond the realms of plausibility at times, and I've got to be, I know this is a high fantasy book, like, don't come for me, I know, but this, you need to have some boundaries, like, that is what world building is all about. It is so important, because unless I have this understanding of where boundaries lie, I don't know if something is normal, if it's acceptable, if it's exceptional, if it's workaday. I just don't have the context I need. So world building is absolutely critical for that reason. And in this one, it was missing. The best thing about this entire book was the map in the front. I mean, who doesn't love a map in the front of a book? But I mean, when that's the best thing about one, like, we need to talk. What was so frustrating about this one is that the magic system especially, but even the plotline, it had potential, but it just wasn't realised. The execution was messy and all over the place. I couldn't bear to read another page, which just goes to show how much I really struggled with it. Epic fantasy is my favourite genre, so I am always looking for more to add to my shelves, but this one was a miss for me. To be fair, I'm not sure I'm that mad about it. I am currently in the middle of 3 million other fantasy series, so perhaps it's not such a bad thing that this one's been dropped off my TBR. Let's move it along to sci-fi, and one of my most anticipated reads ever is The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. I have wanted to read The War of the Worlds for as long as I have been into sci-fi. It is a legend within the genre, and it has sparked multiple adaptations. Most notably, the radio play by Orson Welles back in the 1940s, and the one that most people will probably be aware of, which is the Hollywood blockbuster with Tom Cruise. So I went into this book knowing that it was the source material for these adaptations, and so I didn't really expect it to have the same level of pizzazz in the storytelling or anything like that. I thought that my expectations were pretty much on a level for this one, so that I wouldn't then be disappointed going into it, but oh man, I was. Oh, just never read your bookish heroes, I guess. So the basic principle is that intelligent life exists on Mars, and in actual fact, Martian civilization is far more advanced than our own. Now, they have set their sights on Earth and plan to colonise it in order to outrun the Ice Age, which is threatening life on their own planet. Now, keep in mind that The War of the Worlds was written in 1897. Now, you heard that right, it was 1897. Like, it was so ahead of its time. The fact that it was talking about Martians, about space travel, about climate change science was in its absolute infancy then. It is incredible to think of what Wells created when you consider it in the context of its time. But that is the problem. It's not 1897 anymore. The key issue really is that that context no longer exists for us. In the 21st century, the idea of climate change is by no means a stranger to us. Science especially has advanced at such a rapid rate between when this book was written and present day. So we have lost a lot of the impact that this book would have had in its heyday. It's just not that surprising for us anymore. So here's the thing, that can affect any classic from any genre, and it is not something that should be held against this book by any means, because it of course had no idea back in 1897 what the world would look like now, and that how far removed we would be from that context. But of course it is, and it's something that needs to be acknowledged. I think the main reason why I felt I needed to talk about it in this review is, I mean, does anyone remember that episode of The Big Bang Theory where Sheldon goes into the comic book store and Stuart tells him, oh, the new Hellboy, it's amazing, and Sheldon gets really upset because his mind is pre-blown going into it, and yeah, that As it turned out, I didn't need to worry about my unfair judgment of this book by a modern standard in order to still give it a lowly 2 stars. I found that the writing itself was pretty dry and the pacing was so off. I mean, Martians invade the planet and within a couple of hours, everyone's just popping home for dinner. Like... It also lacked any real excitement and I was just crying out for it. It is not often that I will say that the adaptations are better than the book, but I can't say otherwise in this case. They ultimately improved upon the original material and they gave it that excitement that it was missing. The radio play, for example, it was formatted in news bulletins and people found it so believable that they actually thought the planet was being invaded by Martians. That is the level of connection I wanted to this text, and it was the exact thing that was missing above all else. Knowing that this wouldn't have quite the same impact as perhaps the radio play or the movie would have had, it didn't spare me from still feeling it, unfortunately. So what are you going to do? It's one of those things, but I suppose just for future reference, maybe I'll stick to the radio play instead. Overall impressions though, that it was just a bit dull and drab, and I am gutted. Still, we will move swiftly on to what turned out to be an unexpected win this month. That's right, I am finally giving you a positive review. So this month, me and my little family, we packed up the car and we headed off to the Lake District for a little mini break. Beautiful part of the country, by the way. I highly recommend you go visit it if you haven't before. But what it did mean was that it was an 8-hour drive in the car with an almost 2-year-old. Thank fuck for Peppa Pig. Andy and I then were sort of looking for something just to have on in the background to help us pass the time and keep us sane on what promised to be the longest car drive of our life. Now that is not exactly what we got, but we weren't mad about it. We chose to listen to The Sea in the Sky by Jackson Musker, and the opening section of this, it had us gripped. I mean, we were literally sat somewhere along the M6 like... jaws on the floor. It was so good. The story follows Ty and Bee, 2 astronauts who have been sent to investigate whether there is life on the seabed of one of Saturn's moons in Enceladus. The plan is to determine whether or not these life forms exist, and if they do, to study them so that we can try and use that information and learn how to survive in such extremes. So much is riding on this mission, and Bee in particular is feeling the pressure. Trillions of dollars and a worldwide effort has gone into getting them to Enceladus, and it's not only that. Bee has an opportunity to prove herself within her field, which is incredibly important to her, but she also might go down in history as being the first person to encounter alien life. Lucky for Bee, Ty is a really calming presence and a father figure to her. He helps mentor her through the very toughest parts of this experience that they're sharing, and it is their relationship that is ultimately the heart and soul of this story. But as time goes on and results are lacking, tensions start to build, and then when an accident happens on board that compromises the rest of the mission and then some, cracks start to show. Almost the entire thing is set within the close quarters of the spaceship and the submarine that Ty and Bee are using on a moon that is billions of miles away from Earth. They are so far away that it takes over 3 hours for messages to travel between them and their support team back on Earth. And it was their sense of isolation and loneliness and abandonment that really led to such a brilliantly crafted atmosphere. There were times in our car where you could have cut the tension with a knife. I felt so connected to these 2 main characters, and I was so invested in the outcomes for them. I haven't felt like that about characters in a story for quite a long time, so that was really impressive. I was absolutely rooting for him from the get-go, and the other thing is that the story itself, it felt somewhat plausible, which just helped add this level of authenticity to the whole thing. Unfortunately, the story started to lose its way a little bit, and the pacing, which started out fast and furious, it dropped off completely. which was such a shame. That said, this was such an unexpected reading experience that I really enjoyed. It came completely out of left field for me. Now, the main reason why this was so surprising is because The Sea in the Sky is a podcast. Now, I am new to podcasts because I actually live under a rock in 2005 and I'm a complete technophobe to boot. So what that means is that I don't really understand whether or not this is a typical example of a podcast, but for me, this came across very much like a sci-fi story, a short audiobook that just happened to be formatted in short episodes. Now, partly it was that episodic quality that kept things moving along despite the pacing issues that it later faced. So it definitely seemed to work for me, and I'm wondering whether or not it will be the case in other podcasts. So it's something I'm definitely planning to check out. I know to say that it was the performances in this podcast by the voice actors that just took this over the top for me. They were so good. It was exceptional. I love an audiobook, and one of the things that can really impact the experience in a good or a bad way is the quality of the performance. And this one, it was a ding, ding, ding. It was so well done. In total, it was only around 5 hours long as well, and because it has that episodic nature to it and the fact that it is a very accessible sci-fi story, the science speak is limited and anything that might be considered a bit more technical is fully explained. So if you are looking to dip your toe into sci-fi and you're not sure where to start, this is a great place. I ended up giving this a 3.5 out of 5. It could have been so much higher, but it was the fact that it dropped off the way that it did in terms of both the story and the pacing. That said, I still highly recommend it. As we're on a bit of a roll with the ratings and they're seeing a bit of an uptick, let's keep that going. This is the YA contemporary that I read this month, and it is The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta. June, as I am sure you know, was Pride Month. Now, I try and be diverse in my reading all year round, but I specifically held on to this book for June because it just felt like the perfect time to read it. The Black Flamingo tells Michael's coming-of-age story as a young, British, gay, mixed-race boy growing up in a modern family in London and learning to understand, accept and love himself. This book is told in verse, and honestly, that really intimidated me. I have never been much of a one for poetry. It's only very recently that I have started to dip my toe in, and yeah, historically the reason why I've avoided it is because I'm always worried it will go and I will walk away from it feeling stupid. Now, Michael will tell you that self-confidence is a very fragile thing, and I just didn't need Tennyson dismantling my ego like that. But the poetry in this book is so accessible, and I honestly can't imagine Michael's story being told in any other way. It was the perfect format. It's in no way terrifying, and more than that, it deals with some very big, messy emotions and some huge concepts that are incredibly complicated, and it tells them in such a pure and articulate way. I don't know how Atta did it, but that man is magical. What struck me most about it is that Atta didn't waste time crafting these flowery, elaborate phrases. He just got to the heart of it and he said it as it was. It was so beautiful in its simplicity. Less was definitely more in this one. The story talks about some really big issues, things like identity and self-love, sex and relationships with friends, with family, siblings, wiser family members like uncles and aunts, with our grandparents, with the people that we have sex with our partners, with the people we have crushes on, with teachers, you name it, the list is endless, but most importantly, it focuses on the relationship we have with ourselves. It also dove into some other complex issues, including sexuality, race and religion. One of the things that I appreciated the most about this is the way that Michael's own poetry, it grew as he did. So throughout the book, you have a few of Michael's own poems pop up, and it's a lovely way to help you connect a bit more with his character and to understand the things that he is trying to work his way through. And as he grew up, the theme, the content and the writing itself, it all became more mature, and that just seemed incredibly organic, and I loved that. It didn't make it any more difficult to understand. It, like I said earlier, it was incredibly accessible, the poetry in this, but it did reflect where Michael was at in his life, and I could really appreciate that. Another thing that I really appreciated about this was that it was laid out chronologically. So we meet Michael as a young boy and we leave him as a young man at university. And it is literally the story of those intervening years that we are reading in The Black Flamingo. Authors don't always have to reinvent the wheel, and I really was grateful for the fact that Atta kept a very clear chronology in this, so that I didn't have to then go back and piece things together and become distracted from the story by doing that. Now, I recently read On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, and that book is incredibly raw and powerful, but I struggled immensely with it because it was all over the place in terms of the chronology and events, and I couldn't get a handle on the narrative as a result of that. Now, a lot of people love that about it. I think I am very much in the minority on that one, in that I didn't enjoy it. But the thing that upset me the most is that it was so beautiful and I so wanted to love it, but it was an absolute barrier for me. And thankfully that just wasn't an issue in The Black Flamingo. This was a really special book and it has got a place in my heart. I think it would be particularly impactful for mid to late teenagers who, especially for those people out there who feel like they aren't being seen. But really for anybody around that age. I ended up giving it a 4.5 out of 5, and that was really just in deference to the fact that I am not the target audience for this book. Now, that doesn't always have an impact on my rating, but it did in this case because there were elements of the story that I couldn't quite connect with simply because of my age now. But looking back at myself when I was younger, and knowing younger people now, I mean, I'm not a complete dinosaur. Like, I know that there are things in here that younger people will be able to connect with where I couldn't. So highly, highly recommend it. Keeping with the Pride theme for a minute, and let's move into horror, and this is an entirely sapphic story, which, by the way, why aren't there more of those? If you've got any recommendations for purely sapphic books, please go ahead and drop them in the comment box below. My TBR will thank you, even if my bank balance won't. Plain Bad Heroines is the latest from Emily M. Danforth, who wrote what I think was a pretty popular YA contemporary novel, The Miseducation of Cameron Post. I haven't read that one, but the fact that I even have heard of it goes to show that it must have been pretty popular at some point, because it's not my chosen genre. However, this one is a horror, and that is very much within my wheelhouse, so I dove right in. In this story, we follow 3 young women who are all involved in the filming of a horror movie which is based on the creepy happenings at an all-girls boarding school in Rhode Island back in 1902. Rumours that the school Brooke haunts is cursed have abounded for years, and in this story we join the cast and crew as they are about to move to site to start filming. Predictably, stuff starts to go wrong, and nobody seems to be quite sure whether or not this is all an elaborate setup or if the place really is cursed. This is a dual timeline story, so as well as seeing this modern Hollywood retelling, we also get to find out what really happened back in 1902 as we follow the headmistress from the school at the time. Now, the problem I sometimes find with dual timeline books is that the storylines literally lie side by side with each other, so it's very difficult not to compare and contrast. And I found that I very much preferred the 1902 storyline from this. Throughout the early stages of the book especially, I kept wondering whether or not this was the story that Danforth had wanted to write, and she was just a bit worried that it wouldn't appeal broadly enough. So she threw in some Hollywood glamour to try and entice audiences in. But as the book went on, it became more and more clear that it was the Hollywood storyline that was really the main focus for the author, which was such a shame, I thought, because this 1902 one, it felt so much better in its development in terms of its atmosphere. It was way more creepy and gothic. I was getting far more of the horror vibes from that than I was from this, and I wanted more from this one. Now, besides the atmosphere being better in my mind and the fact that this storyline in 1902 was much more interesting to me just generally, the characters in it were also a bit older, so I preferred reading from their POVs. That is a personal thing, but if you, like me, cannot stand young women who talk in acronyms and hate on each other, then you won't like reading from their perspective either. They were just bloody annoying. Most of the time that I was with them, I just wanted to either ground them or throw their phones in a bin. Perhaps it's safe to say that I am not in the target audience for this one either. The actual mystery element surrounding the curse was interesting, but even that fell a little bit flat for me. But my main gripe with this one was the narrator's voice. Danforth has written this with an omnipotent narrator who has a very distinctive, very annoying, just cannot escape it kind of voice, and it It annoyed me that the narrator kept addressing me directly as a reader. It was pulling me out of the story, and it gave rise to this sort of smug tone of voice which just irked me. What was even worse was that Danforth chose to use footnotes throughout this book. I mean, they pop up almost every other page. They are incredibly prevalent, and she utilises these as a way for the narrator's voice to butt in. Now, either they will give you a little bit more context, a little bit of follow-up, or it will just make a snarky comment. And this ain't Buffy. It ain't Showtime at the Apollo. Like, I didn't need that. I mean, there was even a point, this might just be a me thing, but there was an emoji in the book, and I'm like, what the hell is an emoji doing? I love an emoji, but what is an emoji doing in the middle of a print book? If this is a novel, maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm just getting a bit calmed down. I can applaud Danforth for writing a book which features almost exclusively lesbian relationships. Let's be honest, we do not have enough of that. We have tons of books that focus on solely het relationships or feature only het relationships. Why don't we have more where they're just sapphic relationships or they're just gay relationships? That would be amazing, and it was great to see it here. I can even appreciate that she tried to do something different and make her book stand out from the crowd by utilising a, let's call it an unorthodox narrator's voice, even if I did hate it. But what was unforgivable for me was that the story just didn't pay off. This was easily 300 pages too long, and I was still left wanting more from it. I wanted more creepy, I wanted more atmosphere, I wanted more. Mostly, I just wanted a more satisfying conclusion. Also, don't read this one if you don't like bees. I cannot stress that enough. In the end, I gave this one a 2 out of 5. I promise I'm not really horrible. Like, I do give books more than 2 out of 5 sometimes. In a weird coincidence this month, the other horror book I picked up was The Deep by Nick Cutter, which I also, interestingly, do not recommend for people who don't like bees. Like, I can't tell you enough. Do not pick this book up if you do not like bees. An even weirder coincidence, actually, was that as I was reading Plain Bad Heroines, it directly referenced The War of the Worlds, which I was listening to at the same time, which was super weird. Anyway, I digress. The Deep follows a man called Lucas as he travels down to the deepest known part of our oceans, the Mariana Trench. You see what he did with the title, eh? At the very bottom of the trench is the Trieste, a purpose-built structure. Now, this lab under the sea has been built to the tune of trillions, and Lucas's brother Clayton is the head scientist on site. Now, the reason for the Trieste is because a pandemic, yep, know all about those now, don't we? Has taken hold, and an absurd amount of people have been directly affected by this. I mean, I can't remember precisely how many the book said, but I think it might even have been as much as half the population. Now, a marine biologist who was working in the Mariana Trench accidentally stumbled across what appears to be a miracle cure. So Clayton and his team have been sent down to the depths to try and harvest, harness and study this material to use it to combat the disease. So this one comes with significant content warnings. Obviously, there's the pandemic element, and also there's the nature of the disease itself. Now, both of these things I mentioned only very briefly, but they are there, and it's something that I just think you need to be aware of. So the disease is known as the Gets, which is short for the forgets, and basically it attacks the brain and it stops someone from remembering how to take care of themselves, ranging from things like remembering to eat breakfast or remembering to have a shower, brush their hair that day, to forgetting how to breathe. And so obviously there are parallels there with things like Alzheimer's disease. There's also the issue of a link to severe depression, and when somebody is really struggling with that and unable to take care of themselves. So just be aware. The primary content warnings for this book, though, relate more to the incredibly graphic descriptions of gruesome body horror. There is gore galore in this one, and there is also the issue of historical child abuse and sexual abuse. I will put a full list of all the content warnings in the description box down below. Safe to say that I think it is absolutely crucial that you check them first before reading this book. This one is not for the faint-hearted, and if you are in any way affected by any of those issues, I cannot say it strongly enough, do not read this book. So back to the story, and obviously stuff happens in the Trieste. Now, as Lucas and his guide Al make their way down, communication has been lost for quite some time, so they have no idea what they are about to walk into, and it turns out it is a living hell. Now, the premise had tons of potential for this one. You cannot get much more isolated than being in a purpose-built, self-contained structure at the bottom of the deepest known part of our oceans, with no communication to the surface and only one means of escape. I mean, of course, right? The author did try to really ramp that tension up, and he didn't completely fail, but he didn't totally nail it either. Now, the main question in this one is whether or not what's going on is actually real, and there's some unknown, unseen entity who's like some kind of a puppet master in the background making all of this horrific, nightmarish stuff happen, or if it's actually psychological and everything that's going on is in their heads. Now, I really like that guessing game normally in a story, and I get to feel very smart if I get it right. But in this case, it just left things up in the air for too long. It was as if Cutter wasn't quite sure whether it was real or imagined himself, so the chances of us figuring out were nigh on nil. In the end, Cutter decided to lean heavily into the gross and gruesome and to make this that kind of horror book. The gross and gruesome isn't typically my cup of tea in horror, so that definitely did have an impact on my overall rating. But I don't think that it was all that well done either. It seemed as if Cutter was going to absolute extremes in order to provoke a reaction, and it really did turn my stomach, so I guess kudos. But it was too much in my opinion, and equally the characters, they were more like caricatures. They so absolutely fit this stereotype or the other. It was too much. Ultimately, it felt as if Cutter was overcompensating for what he knew hadn't turned out to be such a great story either. And that really is a shame, because the premise of this book was pretty solid, I thought, but the execution, it was just a mess, and this felt more like an experimental outline of a book than a finished novel. In the end, I give it a 1.5 out of 5, and I took The Troop, another of Cutter's novels, off of my TBR completely after this experience. It just, not for me, thank you very much. Let's move it along to classics, and this month I finally read Jane Eyre. So this year I have challenged myself to read 12 classics in 12 months, and June's pick was, of course, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. So the reason I gave myself this challenge is because, predictably, I want to read more classics. I have always run away from them screaming because I am an average Joe. I do not have an English lit degree. I struggled to connect with it as a subject at school. I did well, but that's only because I had a particular passion for English in general, but the literature side of stuff, oh hell no. I've always wanted to love and appreciate it, but honestly, a little bit like with poetry, I was so fearful that I would never understand it, that I wouldn't connect with it, and so I just avoided them for years. Now, as it turns out, from all the classics that I have read so far, I have only actually liked 3 of them. Persuasion by Jane Austen, Anna Karenina by Tolstoy, and this one. Jane is my new hero. She is tenacious, and she is resourceful, and she is brave, and she is willing, and she is so determined, and she's independent in a time where women really weren't given the option to be that. Jane refuses to give in and just accept things as they are. She strives for better at every given opportunity, and she achieves it, and she does it on her own 2 feet. So Jane is an orphan. She is taken in by her uncle as a young child, but when her uncle passes away, she is left in the care of her aunt, who never wanted her and still doesn't. Jane is ultimately left to pretty much just fend for herself. Now, Jane's aunt is a gentlewoman. Her uncle was a very wealthy man, so she's not living in filth or poverty. But living in a nice house doesn't always mean a nice life. Jane is tormented by her cousin and she's blamed for everything by her aunt. She's punished unfairly. No one ever listens to her and she is just not afforded the same chances. On top of all of that, she is entirely dependent on her aunt. So when the opportunity to go to school comes up, Jane begs for the chance and she is wily enough to convince her aunt that at least it gets her out from under her feet. Believing the school that she's going to be quite a strict environment, Jane's aunt agrees and she sets off. Jane's experience at school is hardly any better than what she faced at home, but she knuckles down and she gets her education. At the age of 18, Jane ventures out into the world and becomes a governess for a young girl who is the ward of a man called Mr. Rochester. I won't sugarcoat this for you. Mr. Rochester is a dick. Like, I could not stand the bloke. But love is blind, and so Jane. The story then focuses on Jane's life from that point on, including the imbalance in her relationship with Mr. Rochester, how unhappy everybody is, and how there are secrets being kept even from the people whom we should be able to trust the most. I loved the intrigue and the dark sense of betrayal in this. It was so unexpected for me. I mean, I'll be honest, I went into Jane Eyre almost completely blind. In fact, I was completely blind. I didn't know anything about it going in. But I had read a couple of Jane Austens before, and I think I just presumed that it was going to be a little bit more of the same. But this was so much more complex and even creepy at times. I mean, the atmosphere was on point and the characters, they felt so real. I could have believed that this was Jane's memoir, not a fictional story. I was also entirely swept away by Bronte's writing. It was beautiful and I understood every word. I wasn't having to go and dust off my old dictionary to look things up. It meant that I wasn't pulled away from the story, and so I was so completely engrossed in it. Jane is, of course, my very favourite thing about this book, and she is a character that will stay with me forever, I think. She is the type of character that I want to be just a little bit more like in life. Now, on to the controversial bit, the ending. Now, I often see this discussed across BookTube or even in real life. I mean, part of why I chose to read Jane Eyre in this round of 12 in 12 was because this is the book that I most often, not that it comes up that often, but when talking about classics, this is the one, and it's about the ending. Now, it seems pretty divisive and I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but what I will say is that it was not the ending that I wanted for Jane, but I can appreciate why other people would find it a perfect conclusion to the story. So Jane's story is now my favourite classic of all time, and in fact it's one of my favourite books of all time. I can't recommend it highly enough, and if you have been putting it off like me for years for some sort of fear that you won't understand or enjoy it, please go and pick it up. I really hope you'll love it too, but I give it 5 out of 5. Let's mix it up and go from a classic to a more modern recent release, which is the thriller I picked up this month. This is Every Value Break by Peter Swanson. This is my second from Swanson, and he seems to be quite a safe pair of hands. He is incredibly well established within the genre. He has the kind of writing style that's just really intensely readable, and you can tell he knows what he's doing. But I was unfortunately left feeling a little bit blah about his other book that I read, which was Her Every Fear. I think I gave it a middle of the road 3. So what that meant was that I wasn't really going into this one with particularly high hopes. I was open-minded, but I wasn't really expecting anything. Turns out it was a good job I wasn't, because this was another wah for me. Every Value Break follows Abigail, who is a wildly unlikable young woman, but deliberately so, I would say, and she has recently gotten married. So during her hen do, or bachelorette party over in the States, which frankly sounds far more fun than a hen party, but anyway, she has one too many and she ends up cheating on her husband-to-be. Chalking it up to life experience and vodka, Abigail resolves to marry her billionaire fiancé anyway, subscribing wholly to the thought process that what he doesn't know won't hurt him. All goes smoothly until a day or so into their honeymoon on, of course, a completely isolated island without a Wi-Fi signal, because apparently the stockbroker regulars can't be trusted to put their phone down unless it literally won't work. As she's walking around, Abigail spots the man that she cheated on her husband with across the room, and suddenly her recent past and her very promising future look like they're about to collide. The story spirals from there as Abigail desperately tries to fix the mess that she's in. But as things become increasingly tense, it's not just her marriage that's in danger, but her life as well. There were a couple of twists and turns in this one, which I did appreciate, but there was nothing groundbreaking here. Ultimately, the whole thing seemed to rely on that slasher horror movie cliche where the woman runs upstairs instead of out of the door and away from danger. Abigail just kept making some really weird decisions, and really it became obvious that the reason for that was to keep the plot moving forward. Equally, there comes a point in the story where Abigail just suddenly, coincidentally, has these life-saving skills she happens to need, and I mean, really? I also found it repetitive at points, and watch out for lots of people drinking. I mean, I know that they were on holiday and they must have been bored without Facebook or something, but they were just constantly drinking. I mean, it was excessive. Hats off to Swanson though for working smarter, not harder in terms of building the atmosphere. Setting it on an isolated island with no means of contact with the outside world, I mean, it did all the heavy lifting for him. But arguably that left him free to fine tune it where he needed to in order to make this a better book. So really, there are no excuses. I will say though that Swanson even had me rooting for Abigail by the end of this book, and I mean that is no mean feat. She has got to be one of the most unlikable characters I have read in a very long time, and that's including Mr. Rochester. Overall though, it was another meh from me from this author. There was some style, there was some substance, but there was only 2 stars. On to contemporary / literary fiction. I mean, I don't know what the difference is between those two, so if you do, let me know, please. This is Transcendent Kingdom by Gyasi. This was a beautifully written book, and it deals with some big issues, things like the struggles and strains of mental health conditions, the complex relationships of family, and this concept of conflict between science and religion. And this is a short book too. It's only around 260 pages and it packs a real punch. Gifty is born in Alabama to her Ghanaian parents who have migrated to the US in hopes of a better future for their children. Life in Ghana was by no means bad, but Gifty's mum especially really bought into the idea of the American dream, and so she packed up her home, her life, and left her country behind in order to give it a shot. But their experiences of life in the US are not all they hoped it would be. The impact of racism, including racial profiling, the loss of home and of hope, all lead to tragedy, and before long, Gifty and her mum are all that remain of her family. The loss and the trauma that they experience, it marks them in very different ways, and the story deals with some very difficult topics, including grief and addiction. Whilst her mother turns to religion for comfort, Gifty's faith is completely shaken, and she ends up throwing herself into her work and academic research in neurobiology. The book is skillful in its handling of these really difficult topics. They're so emotive, but it does it so very, very well, and it holds up a mirror to what drives us and how much of our past really influences our future. I know that this is a bit of a cliche, but this was an incredibly thought-provoking read. I am neither a scientist nor am I religious, so to read of Gifty's experience, it was really enlightening. I also found the neurological elements in this book really interesting, and to me, I mean, I'm a complete layman, but they felt very well researched. There is a discussion in the book about whether or not things like addiction and depression could be completely eradicated with the right research and a targeted approach. And honestly, I just found it fascinating and hopeful. I was so impressed by this book right up until the end. The problem was that the ending just seemed to come out of nowhere. It's not that it wasn't a good ending, it's not that it wasn't fully formed, it's just that it happened like that. It was as if Gyasi had decided she just got bored of writing it, and so she just stopped. I give it a 3.5 out of 5 in the end. I mean, there was so very much that I liked and appreciated about this book, but it was ultimately a slice of life lit fic, which is far from my preferred thing. I'm much more plot driven in terms of my reading taste. That said, I would still highly recommend this. If you are more of a literary fiction reader, definitely go ahead and pick this up. I think you'll like it a lot more. Just a quick note to add as well, that aside from the sort of content mentioned earlier, there's also a content warning in this one for animal testing. Right, my loves, we are on the home straight now. I'm going to move into the final category for June's wrap up, and that is graphic novels and comics. So because I hit a bit of a slump early on in the month, I really needed a couple of quick wins, and I picked up a couple of comic books whilst I was browsing around the library one day, and the very first one that I grabbed was Rat Queens Volume 1, Sass and Sorcery. Volume 1 collects issues 1 to 5 of Rat Queens, and man, this was a wild ride. Imagine World of Warcraft meets The Boys, then throw in some magic mushrooms and a gang of female mercenaries and you got it. It was so good. The Rat Queens are 4 kick-ass women who work together as a gang for hire. Now, they tend to create as much trouble as they solve, and after the latest bar brawl, they find themselves very firmly on the mayor's shit list. So they and other merc gangs like them who find themselves in trouble with the wrong person end up being tasked with a menial job, and if they do that and do it well, they will be put back in the good graces. While on the job, the Queens are attacked by an assassin, and they later find out that all of the other merc gangs were as well. Now, clearly this is a setup, and the story then moves on to trying to find out who was behind these assassination attempts. I mean, this storyline was great fun anyway, but it was the world building and the characters that really sent this one over the edge for me. I was craving a pick-me-up, and this one could not have come at a better time. It is, as the title suggests, full of sass and sorcery. It is dripping in humour, and it has at its heart a really solid, if not perfectly executed, plotline. I also found a new character to add to my list of all-time favourites in Betty. Betty is a free-spirited halfling thief. She is mostly doped up the entire time, and she just wants to have a good time. But she's also sweet and genuine and loyal, and she is an absolute savage in a fight. She was the standout for me, but I have to say I liked all of the characters in this. I thought the 4 queens themselves, they were all great, and they had a really good dynamic between them. I also loved that it showed a different side of female friendship. So the dynamic between the queens, it wasn't in any way catty, it wasn't like saccharine and sweet, it wasn't cliquey. It felt quite genuine and real, and I mean, it was everything I wanted from a badass girl gang. Most of all, it was the sense of humour that won the day for me. It reminded me a lot of Firefly, that kind of sarky, understated sense of humour, and it's my favourite thing. In terms of the artwork, it was bang on for me. It reminded me of the 90s X-Men cartoons that I came up on, so of course I loved it. I also really enjoyed the panel layouts. I thought, particularly in the action scenes, they were great. It helped add to that level of dynamism for me, which is really what I want from a comic. I mean, it sounds like a given that a comic, a graphic novel, it would give you that sense of immediacy in the artwork and the panels and things when there are action scenes, but trust me when I say it ain't, and it's one of my biggest criticisms when it comes to comics. If the artists and the writers, they aren't making the most of the visual storytelling element, I mean, it is a comic book, for God's sake, like, you've got to utilise that strength, and it's not always the case, but it definitely was in this one. It was used to the max. If you are a bit of a nerd like me, if you like comic books and WoW and fantasy worlds and sarcastic rockabilly elf necromancers get stuck in bar brawls all the time, and you want something that's action-packed and fun and rowdy, you can't go wrong with this. Definitely recommend picking it up. I ended up giving Rat Queens a 4.5 out of 5. The only real criticism I had with this was that it was very clearly women drawn by men. It's something that my husband hears me yabbering on about a lot. I sort of get on a bit of a soapbox, but whenever he plays a new game on his Xbox or whatever, like, the female characters are in armour, which is just metal underwear. Let's be real, half the time it isn't even that. It's not even underwear. It's barely there. But the men, they'll all have full suits of armour or whatever, and it just you can tell it gets my goat, can't you? He has to hear about it all the time, but yeah, now you get to too. And finally, I'm going to end with my very favourite read of the month. I read a few great books in June, but apparently nothing beats out nostalgia and a sequel to one of my favourite 80s cult movies of all time that I didn't know I needed. I picked this up on an absolute whim, and it has hands down been the book that has made me the happiest all year. This is Lost Boys Volume 1 by Tim Seeley. It was everything. It was everything. It was everything. It was so good. If you haven't seen The Lost Boys, then number one, what are you doing? Go and watch it immediately. And number two, it is about Sam and Michael, two brothers who moved with their recently divorced mum Lucy to live with their grandpa in Santa Carla, California. Santa Carla is known for two things, the Giant Dipper and all the damn vampires. And it is thanks to the teenage bloodsuckers currently roaming around Santa Carla that it has become known as the murder capital of the world. Michael, being the brooding leather jacket wearing type that he is, ends up caught up with the gang after he catches the eye of their leader David, who is played by Kiefer Sutherland, who, FYI, remains top of my freebie 5 list. It is a super cheesy teen horror with a heavy 80s SoCal filter, and it is the best thing ever. The comic pretty much picks up right where the film left off, so slight spoilers for that, movie fans. It has been a couple of months since the Lost Boys bit the dust, and Michael is working in a care home whilst Sam is working at the comic book store with the Frog Brothers, and everyone is just trying to get back to some kind of normal in life. But there's a rumour that there's a new bunch of vamps running around looking for a long-lost vampire city under the streets of Santa Carla. With the death toll rising, Michael, Sam and the Frog Brothers go out to investigate and come across a nest of all-female vamps, because apparently there is no glass ceiling in vampirism and the whole damn thing's a matriarchy. I mean, where do I sign up? I was a little bit worried when I first picked this up that this was just going to be a rehashing of the film, so I was so pleased when I realised that it wasn't. The story largely stands alone as well, so it doesn't matter if you haven't seen the film. Obviously it helps and it will give you a little bit of that kind of context that you might otherwise be missing, but really everything you need to know is told in the comic. Now, the risk when picking up something that's associated with your favourite ever franchises is, of course, that it might let you down, but Seeley nailed it. You could tell that he was obviously a fan of the franchise too. He captured the characters, he captured the feeling of it all. The whole thing was the perfect sequel for me, and it really did do the film justice. And it had to be a comic book, right? Of course it did. There were a lot of nods to the fans in this, but it wasn't just fanfic. The storyline itself, it holds up on its own. It's interesting, it's full of action, it's got enough there that I think you can objectively, I can't obviously, but you could objectively rate this highly on its own without the film behind it. There were parts where I laughed my head off, and there were definitely points when I did like a quick furtive look around to make sure I was on my own and then gave it one of them. Definitely did a few air punches. Even Sexy Saxman makes a cameo. Now, if you are unfamiliar with Sexy Saxman, allow me. I mean, it is the best thing ever. If you, like me, are a total sucker for The Lost Boys, you will absolutely adore this. It's 5 out of 5. So that is my June wrap-up. Not too bad. Although it wasn't the best reading month for me in terms of ratings, I had a blast with some of these books, and actually it was maybe a month of extremes, but it was memorable. At least you can say that for it. Let me know if any of these books are on your TBR, if you've read any of them, if you've loved them, if you've hated them. I would love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. Thank you as ever for watching, and I will see you again soon. Bye! We are well into July as I'm feeling. Don't know why I've done this. It's like I'm on the generation game. Like boarding school. Boarding? Ooh, awkward. Hello. Hello. All right, baby. Hiya.
Hiya, Mummy.
Hello, gorgeous.
Okay. Mummy.
She probably wants a hug first.
It's Mummy. Look, who's
Oh,
that?
wow.
Oh, wow. Look, who's that? Can you see? Hello. Who's that? Sweary lady. Not me, you.
We went to the works.
Oh, thank you. Preview for a book haul. Oh, look, you got a new colouring book.
Do you want to show BookTube your new book?
You're going to show BookTube your book haul. You need your nose wiping. Oh, look at that. Now you can see why I've got a red ball over there, don't you? Oh, that's thrown me off a bit. Oh, no, it wasn't 78 at all. It didn't know in 1919. Let's switch it up and go from a very, very old book to a recent release and talk about the thriller that I picked up this month, which was Every Value Bake. Bake? Do you bake fans? In Santa Clara, California. I'll say that properly in a minute. Time that he hears. Sounds like I'm about to burst into a song. Oh, what is happening? It's obviously, this has gone on too long.